"You're too late," Nora Bell said, staring at the county notice in Ethan's hand. "If that cabin isn't repaired soon, they'll mark it unsafe and take it back." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The German Shepherd was standing at the fireplace, nose pressed to the cracked stone, refusing to move. "Not tonight, boy," Ethan murmured. But Ranger scratched once, slow and deliberate. The sound underneath was not stone. It was empty space. Ethan froze. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, a forgotten house held its breath, and $40 was about to become the most important money he ever spent. Ethan Walker was 41 years old when he walked out of the Cedar Hollow County Records office, with a folded deed in his hand, $40 poorer, and somehow heavier than he had been when he walked in. The paper was thin, yellowed at the edges, stamped twice in blue ink, and it gave him legal ownership of 5 acres beside Alder Run Creek and a stone cabin the town had stopped speaking of kindly years ago. Behind him, the screen door slapped shut with a tired wooden clap, and Ranger, his 6-year-old German Shepherd, lifted his head as if the sound had meant something. The dog stood beside the bottom step, sable coat brushed gold by the late afternoon sun, ears high, eyes steady, the way he always looked when Ethan was pretending not to feel anything. Across the street, 2 men outside Bell's grocery paused with coffee cups halfway to their mouths. One of them gave a small laugh, not loud enough to be challenged, but clear enough to be understood. Ethan did not look over. He had heard worse than laughter. He had also learned that a man could bleed from things that never touched his skin. A landlord's note folded too neatly, a job application never returned, a room gone quiet when he mentioned he had served, a handshake that tightened with respect but loosened before trust could form. He tucked the deed into the inside pocket of his faded canvas jacket and rested 2 fingers on Ranger's head. "Well, boy," he said softly, "looks like we bought ourselves a problem." Ranger's tail moved once, not wagging exactly, more like agreement. Cedar Hollow sat in the western hills of North Carolina, not far from the long blue folds of the mountains, a town small enough for people to remember your truck before they remembered your name. It was early October, warm in the sun and cool in the shade, with red leaves gathering along the curbs and the smell of cut hay drifting in from fields beyond the church road. Nothing about the day looked cursed. Nothing about it looked holy either. It was just an ordinary American afternoon, the kind that kept moving whether a man had somewhere to sleep or not. Ethan had arrived that morning with a military duffel, a dented thermos, Ranger's leash, and $40 in cash folded behind his driver's license. $40 was not much money. It was barely a tank of gas, a few groceries, a pair of used boots if a man did not mind worn soles. But in the back room of the county office, beneath a buzzing fluorescent light, Nora Bell had slid a file across the counter and told him there was one property nobody wanted. Whitaker Stone Cabin, 5 acres, unpaid taxes, no current heirs, no utilities worth mentioning, roof trouble, well trouble. Foundation probably sound, though no inspector had bothered to confirm it in years. Folks call it the Hollow House, Nora had said, peering at him over the rim of her glasses. Not because of ghosts, if you ask me. More because people like naming what they don't understand. Then she had lowered her voice, not out of fear, but out of habit. Nobody stays there. They buy it cheap, talk big, last a month or 2, then leave it to the vines. Some places hold sorrow longer than others. Ethan had listened without interrupting. Ranger had sat by his chair, quiet and alert, his nose angled toward the file cabinet, as if the room itself had a history. "Does it have walls?" Ethan asked. Nora blinked. "Stone walls. Good ones, from what I remember. A roof? Leaking, but standing. A hearth?" She studied him then, as though the question had come from another time. "Yes, big fieldstone fireplace. Built by Harold Whitaker himself, they say." Ethan had nodded, not because the place sounded safe, and not because he believed in luck. He nodded because standing walls, a roof, and a hearth were more than he had been promised in a long while. So he counted out 2 20s on the counter, signed where Nora pointed, and became the owner of a forgotten cabin at the end of a dirt road most maps no longer bothered to name. Now outside in the amber light, he started walking west with Ranger at his side, past the grocery, past the post office, past the little diner where silverware clinked, and people glanced up just long enough to measure him. His boots raised dust from the shoulder of the road. Ranger moved close, not pulling, not drifting, matching his pace the way only an old friend could. Ethan thought about turning back once, though there was nowhere to turn back to. The garage room behind Martin Cole's house was empty now. The cot was stripped. His few tools were in his duffel. The note telling him to be gone by Monday was still in his pocket, creased down the middle like a quiet verdict. He had not been thrown out with shouting. That might have been easier. Shouting gave a man something to push against. This had been gentler, cleaner, colder. You've had enough time. Don't make this difficult. He had read it twice, then folded it once, while Ranger watched from the doorway with those patient brown eyes that always seemed to say, "I'm still here." By the time Ethan reached the old logging road, the sun had slipped lower behind the trees. Alder Run whispered somewhere ahead, hidden under a canopy of sycamore and pine. The air smelled of damp leaves, wild mint, and stone cooling after daylight. Then the cabin appeared. It stood in a clearing like something that had survived being forgotten. Its chimney rose crooked but proud. Its porch sagged at one corner. Ivy climbed the left wall in thick ropes, and the front door hung slightly inward, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. Ethan stopped at the edge of the clearing. Ranger stepped ahead of him, then froze, eyes fixed on the dark square of the doorway. For a long moment neither of them moved. The place looked tired, not evil, not cursed. Tired, Ethan knew the difference. He took the deed from his pocket and looked at it once more, the ink already softening where his thumb had pressed too hard. $40, 5 acres, one cabin nobody wanted. He almost laughed, but the sound caught somewhere in his chest and became something quieter. "All right," he said. "Let's see what's left." Ranger crossed the clearing first. He climbed the porch steps with careful paws, lowered his nose to the warped boards, then went straight inside as if he had been expected. Ethan followed. Dust shifted in the golden light. The room smelled of old ash and dry wood. At the far wall, the fireplace waited, broad and dark, its hearthstone cracked clean through the middle. Ranger walked to it, sniffed once, and stood perfectly still. Then he looked back at Ethan, and in that look was something almost human, something that made the hair rise gently along Ethan's arms. Ethan did not know it then, but the town had been wrong. The Hollow House was not empty. It had been keeping something safe. Long before Cedar Hollow, before the deed, before the cracked hearthstone and the little stone cabin waiting under a roof of red leaves, Ethan Walker had belonged to places without ever feeling owned by them. He was born in a flat Ohio town where the railroad tracks divided the old neighborhoods from the newer ones, and where a man's worth was often measured by whether he showed up on time, kept his truck running, and did not complain when his back hurt. His father, Raymond Walker, worked as a mechanic at a county garage, a broad-handed man who smelled of motor oil, black coffee, and cold mornings. His mother, Joanne, worked at the public library, shelving books with the same patient care other people gave to family silver. Their house was small, white-sided and plain, but in Ethan's memory it had always sounded alive. The clink of plates after supper, the low murmur of AM radio, his father's wrench dropping onto concrete, his mother turning pages in the next room. Nobody in that house wasted words. Love came in practical forms: a repaired bicycle, a lunch packed before dawn, a hand on the shoulder that lasted only a second but stayed with you all day. Ethan learned early how to fix things that were supposed to be thrown away. His father taught him to listen before touching a machine. "Everything tells you what it needs," Raymond used to say, leaning over an engine with his sleeves rolled up. "You just have to stop thinking you already know." Ethan did not understand then that the advice applied to people too. After high school, he enlisted, not because he was running from home, and not because he was chasing glory. He wanted structure. He wanted to be useful. He wanted a life where the rules were written clearly enough that a man could follow them and know he had done right. The service gave him discipline, tools, long days, early mornings, and the strange comfort of being surrounded by people who did not ask him to explain silence. He became the kind of man others trusted with keys, schedules, repairs, hard weather, and the quiet parts of a job nobody wanted to do. He was never loud about it. He did not need to be. For years, that was enough. Then he came home and discovered that peace could be more confusing than duty. The world looked the same, but it moved differently. Grocery store aisles felt too bright. Waiting rooms felt too small. Conversations ended the moment people ran out of safe questions. They thanked him for his service, and he always nodded, because he knew they meant well. But gratitude was not the same as knowing where to stand. Jobs came and went. Some ended because the business closed. Some because Ethan did not quite fit the rhythm of small talk and birthday cakes in break rooms. Some because he could fix almost anything except the invisible distance people kept around him. When his mother passed and his father followed 2 years later, the Ohio house was sold to settle old bills. Ethan signed papers at a kitchen table he had once eaten cereal on, then walked outside with a cardboard box of photographs, 2 socket wrenches, and the feeling that a door had closed without making a sound. Ranger came into his life a year after that, through a veteran support program run out of Asheville. The German Shepherd had been passed over twice, because he was too watchful, too serious, too slow to charm strangers. Ethan liked him immediately. Ranger did not perform happiness. He studied the room, chose his corner, and waited. The woman at the program told Ethan, "He needs someone patient." Ethan had looked down at the dog, who was pretending not to look back, and said, "So do I." It was not dramatic after that. No miracle, no swelling music, just 2 quiet souls learning each other's habits. Ranger woke him from bad dreams without making a scene. Ethan remembered to eat because Ranger needed feeding. They walked every morning, rain or shine, and over time Ethan began to notice things again. The smell of wet grass, the way sunlight collected on fence wire, the kindness in a cashier's voice when she asked about the dog. Ranger did not cure loneliness, but he gave it shape, gave it footsteps beside him. And when the last rented room disappeared, when Martin Cole's note left Ethan with nowhere familiar to sleep, Ranger sat by the door and waited for the next command. As if he already knew the truth Ethan was only beginning to learn. A man can lose his house, his town, even the version of himself other people understood, and still not be finished. The note had been left in an envelope taped to the outside of Ethan's door, though calling it a door was generous. It was a plywood panel hung on 2 tired hinges at the back of Martin Cole's garage, painted the same dull gray as the siding, so that from the driveway it nearly disappeared into the building. Ethan found it just after sunrise, with Ranger standing beside him, and the smell of wet gravel lifting from the yard after a night of soft rain. The envelope had his name written in block letters. Not Ethan, not Walker, just E. Walker, as if whoever wrote it had wanted to keep the matter clean and distant. He peeled the tape off carefully, because carefulness was a habit that had outlived most of the places where it was useful, and unfolded the single sheet inside. Martin's words were brief, polite, and almost kind in the way a closed gate can look harmless from the road. "Ethan, I need the room cleared by Monday. The new owners want the property empty before appraisal. You've had time to get settled, and I hope you understand. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. Martin." Ethan read it once, then again. The rain had stopped, but drops kept falling from the edge of the roof in a slow, uneven rhythm. Somewhere inside the main house, a coffee maker beeped. A cabinet opened. A life continued. Ethan folded the note down the original crease and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Ranger looked up at him, eyes steady, ears slightly back, not afraid, just listening. "Guess that's that," Ethan said. His voice sounded ordinary, which surprised him a little. He had learned that the worst moments did not always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they came with neat handwriting, good manners, and a man who would avoid looking you in the eye until your things were gone. He had rented the room for 6 months, though rent was not the exact word. He paid what he could when day labor came through. He fixed the loose gutter over Martin's kitchen. He replaced 2 rotted fence posts, patched the mower, cleaned the garage after the spring leak, and kept mostly to himself. Martin had once called him dependable. That was before the buyers came, before the survey flags appeared in the yard, like small bright warnings. Before Ethan became less a person than something still left to remove. Inside the room, morning light pressed through a narrow window above the workbench. There was not much to pack. A duffel with clothes rolled tight. A shaving kit. His father's 2 socket wrenches wrapped in a towel. A coffee tin full of screws, washers, and odd nails. Ranger's brush, leash, and metal bowl. 3 photographs in a paper envelope. His parents standing beside their old Ford, Ethan in uniform beside a row of cinderblock barracks, and Ranger on the day they met, looking away from the camera with royal suspicion. He set the photographs in the duffel last. The cot creaked when he folded it, a sound too loud for the small room. Dust rose from the concrete floor, shining briefly in the slant of sun. Ranger walked to the empty corner where his blanket had been and sniffed the floor, as if confirming the loss. Ethan watched him and felt something loosen in his chest, not breaking exactly but giving way. "I'm sorry, boy," he murmured. Ranger came over and pressed his head against Ethan's knee. That was all. No drama, no judgment. Just warmth through denim. By 9 o'clock, Martin finally came around the side of the garage, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the gravel between them. He was a broad man in his late 50s, with a red face and a ball cap from a feed store that had closed 10 years earlier. "Did you see the note?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I saw it." Martin cleared his throat. "It's not personal. People always said that when something had already become personal because they had chosen convenience over courage." Ethan looked at him, not hard, not soft. "I know." Martin shifted his weight. "You got somewhere lined up?" Ethan glanced toward the road, where early light lay pale across the ditch grass. "Working on it." There was a pause then, the kind where a better man might have offered breakfast, or a day, or at least the truth. Martin only nodded, relieved that Ethan was not making him feel what he had done. Ethan lifted the duffel, clipped Ranger's leash to his collar, and stepped out from under the garage roof. The yard smelled of mud, gasoline, and cut pine from the survey stakes. He did not look back until he reached the mailbox. The gray door had already blended into the wall again, as if the room had never held him. For a moment anger came, not hot, not wild, just a small, clean flame. Then Ranger tugged once, gently toward the road. Ethan breathed in, breathed out, and followed. By noon, the road into Cedar Hollow had narrowed to 2 lanes and a soft shoulder of red clay, with soybean fields giving way to low hills, and low hills lifting toward the hazy blue shape of the mountains. Ethan walked where the grass was thin, duffel strap cutting into one shoulder, Ranger moving beside him with the patience of an animal who understood distance better than complaint. A few trucks passed. One slowed, not enough to offer a ride, just enough for the driver to look him over and decide what kind of story he might be. Ethan kept his eyes forward. He had been judged by cleaner men in brighter rooms. Cedar Hollow appeared gradually, as if it had been built from habit instead of planning. A white church with a leaning sign. A bait shop that also sold boiled peanuts. A diner with red vinyl booths visible through the front window. Bell's Grocery with crates of apples stacked outside. And beyond it, the county records office. A square brick building with green shutters and an American flag turning lazily in the warm October air. Ethan stopped across the street and studied it for a moment. There was no reason for his heart to be beating so carefully. It was only a building, only a counter, only another person who could say no. Ranger sat down beside him, looked at the door, then looked back at Ethan as if to say the world had never opened itself for men who waited too long. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I know." Inside, the office smelled of paper, dust, floor polish, and the faint lemon scent of someone trying to make old government furniture feel cheerful. A ceiling fan turned with a small, uneven click. Behind the front desk sat Nora Bell, a woman somewhere past 60, narrow-shouldered but sharp-eyed, with silver hair clipped at the back of her head and a cardigan the color of dried sage. She was sorting envelopes into wooden trays, each movement, each glance quicker than most people's questions. Her eyes went first to Ranger, then to Ethan's boots, then to the duffel, then finally to his face. She did not smile, but she did not look away either. "You lost?" she asked. Ethan almost said yes. Instead, he touched 2 fingers to the brim of his worn cap, looking for county-held property. Something unpaid, something nobody's fighting over. Nora leaned back slightly. "You buying or dreaming?" There was no cruelty in it, just experience. Ethan reached into his jacket and laid 2 folded 20s on the counter. The bills looked small there, almost embarrassed by the amount of room around them. Buying, if that's enough to start a conversation. Nora looked at the money, then at him again. For a moment the room held still except for the fan. "Name?" "Ethan Walker." "You from here?" "No, Mom." "Planning to stay?" He glanced down at Ranger, whose ears had tipped toward the rows of file cabinets. "Planning to repair whatever I can." Something in Nora's face changed, not softened exactly, but adjusted. She rose, walked to the back wall, and pulled open a drawer labeled WZ. "Most folks come in asking what a place is worth," she said. "You're the first in a while who asked what's left." She returned with a gray folder tied in cotton tape. On the tab, in faded ink, were the words White Tacker Stone Cabin. Nora set it between them, as though it contained something heavier than paper. 5 acres off Alder Run, old stone cabin, built late 70s by Harold Whitaker. His wife Miriam kept it after he passed. She died without close kin willing to claim it. Taxes sat. County took custody. We've tried auctions, twice. Third time nobody bid. Ethan listened. Ranger stood slowly, nose lifting toward the folder. Why? He asked. Nora gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had trusted itself more. People talk. About what? About the Hollow House. The name settled over the counter like dust disturbed by a footstep. Nora untied the folder and turned a photograph toward him. It showed a cabin under a tangle of ivy, porch sagging, chimney still upright against a pale sky. They say it won't let people rest. Say the air goes heavy. Say every owner leaves sadder than when they came. But my opinion. She tapped the photo once. Old houses collect old grief, and small towns confuse grief with ghosts. Ethan looked at the picture. He noticed the crooked porch. Yes, the vines, the cracked step, the roofline bowed at one end. But he also noticed the stonework. Careful, patient, fitted by hand. Not thrown together, not cheap. Foundation, he asked. Nora's brows lifted. Likely solid. Water? A spring line used to feed the place. Might be clogged. Fireplace? Big fieldstone. Harold built it himself. Ethan ran his thumb along the edge of the photograph. Something in his chest, quiet for a long time, stirred. Not hope exactly, but the memory of it. How much? Nora looked at the 220s on the counter. Today? $40 clears the filing fee. After that, the trouble is yours. Ethan nodded once. Ranger rested his chin lightly against the counter's edge, eyes fixed on the cabin photo as if he had recognized a road neither of them had walked yet. Trouble I can work with, Ethan said. It's being nowhere that wears a man down. Nora held his gaze then, and for the first time she did smile, small and sad and respectful. Then let's put your name on it, Mr. Walker. The path to Whitaker's stone cabin did not begin like a road so much as a memory the woods had nearly taken back. Ethan found it behind the old bait shop where the pavement ended, marked by 2 rusted fence posts and a county sign so faded the letters had become suggestions. Alder Run Road, it might have said once. Or maybe only Alder Run. The rest had been bleached away by sun, rain, and the indifference of people who no longer had reason to go that direction. Ethan shifted the duffel on his shoulder and stepped into the grass, Ranger moving ahead of him now with a different kind of focus. In town, the dog had walked beside him like a companion. Here he moved like a scout, nose low, ears turning to every small sound. A squirrel in the leaves, creek water over stone, the dry whisper of late-season grass rubbing against his legs. The afternoon was leaning toward evening, and the light had gone honey-colored, pouring through the trees in long slanted bands. It touched everything gently, even the things that had been left too long. A collapsed rail fence, a mailbox with no door, a stretch of stone wall half swallowed by moss. Ethan followed the old track past blackberry canes and sumac, past a clearing where goldenrod stood shoulder-high, past a shallow ditch where rainwater had gathered and reflected the sky in broken pieces. He was tired in the deep, quiet way that did not ask for pity. His shoulder ached under the duffel. His feet were sore. Hunger sat somewhere low in him, patient and familiar. Still, with every step away from town, the air seemed to loosen. No one was watching him decide what kind of man he was. No one was waiting for him to explain why he had not yet become easier to understand. After nearly half a mile, Ranger stopped. Not suddenly, not with alarm, but with the full stillness of an animal arriving at something important. Ethan came up behind him and saw the cabin through the trees. For a moment he did not breathe. It stood at the edge of a small hollow, backed by pines, and, facing the creek, its stone chimney, rising higher than the roof, as if it had been the first thing built and the last thing willing to fall. Ivy covered the left wall in thick green ropes. The porch dipped at one corner. The tin roof was patched in 2 places and rusted in 3. One front window had cracked from corner to corner, and the door hung inward just enough to make the dark room beyond look like a mouth about to speak. But the walls were there, real walls. Stone at the base, hand-laid, patient, fitted so closely Ethan could feel the old craftsman's pride from where he stood. He had seen expensive houses with less honesty in them. He walked closer, one step at a time, boots pressing into the soft earth. The yard was wild but not dead. Ferns grew near creek bank. A young maple had rooted beside the porch. Somewhere under the weeds there might have once been a garden. Ranger climbed the steps first. The boards gave a low complaint but held. He sniffed along the threshold, then turned back and looked at Ethan with those steady brown eyes. Not warning, not fear. Permission, maybe. Or invitation. Ethan set his hand on the door and pushed. It opened with a long wooden sigh. Inside, dust hung in the light like fine ash. The room was larger than he expected. One main space with a sleeping loft above, a rough kitchen wall to the right, and at the far end, the fireplace Nora had mentioned. It dominated the room, broad and dark, built from river stone and field stone, with a hearth that stretched out like the palm of an open hand. The center hearthstone was cracked clean through, a pale line running across it from front to back. Ethan noticed the crack, filed it away in the part of his mind that made lists without paper. Roof first, door second, window before rain, hearth before cold nights. The place smelled of old smoke, dry leaves, mouse nests, and thyme. Yet beneath all that there was something else. Cedar maybe, or sun-warmed stone. A trace of what the house had been before people renamed it with their fear. Ethan crossed the room slowly. His hand brushed the mantel, leaving a clean streak through years of dust. "You held on," he said, though he was not sure whether he meant the cabin or himself. Ranger did not explore the kitchen corner or the loft ladder. He went straight to the hearth. He lowered his nose to the cracked stone and breathed in deeply. Then he stood there, perfectly still, ears lifted, tail quiet, every line of him listening. Ethan watched him. "What is it?" Ranger glanced back, then looked down again at the stone. Outside, Alder Run murmured over rock. A leaf broke loose somewhere and tapped against the porch roof. The cabin felt empty, yes, but not hollow. Not the way people meant it. It felt like a room after someone has finished speaking, and the last words are still in the air. Ethan crouched beside Ranger and placed his palm on the hearthstone. It was cool under his hand, solid, ordinary, and yet Ranger stayed fixed on it, as if the whole house had led them to this one place. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "First night here and you already found a mystery." Ranger's ears flicked, and for the first time since morning, Ethan felt something rise in him that was not worry, not shame, not endurance. It was small and cautious, but alive. Maybe this place did not need a man with money. Maybe it needed someone who knew how to listen before touching what was broken. Ethan did not try to make the cabin a home on the first day. He knew better than that. A place that had been neglected for years did not need grand promises. It needed a broom, a bucket, a steady hand, and someone willing to begin where beginning looked almost foolish. The next morning, he opened the front door before sunrise and let the cool October air move through the room. Ranger stepped onto the porch, stretched his long back, then settled at the top step like a guard who had accepted his post. Ethan stood in the doorway with a broom he had found behind the pantry wall, its handle cracked but usable, and looked at the dust lying across the floorboards like a second skin. "All right," he said quietly. "One corner at a time, that became the rule. One corner, one board. One nail pulled clean instead of 10 yanked loose." He swept mouse droppings and leaves into careful piles. He dragged rotten cloth and broken jars outside. He opened the cracked window and propped it with a stick, letting sunlight fall across the fireplace for the first time in what felt like years. Dust rose in soft golden clouds, and each time Ethan coughed, Ranger lifted his head, checked him, then rested again. By noon, the main room had changed almost imperceptibly, which was how real change often came. Not like a trumpet, but like a cloth passed over a dirty pane. The cabin was still poor, still wounded, still full of work, but now it had a clean path from the door to the hearth. That mattered. After that came the roof. Ethan climbed carefully, using an old ladder he reinforced with scrapboards and common sense. The tin was loose near the back corner, where rain had slipped in and stained the ceiling dark. He did not have proper materials yet, so he used a tarp, bent nails straight with a hammer, and weighted the edges with flat stones until he could do better. It was ugly, it held. He took that as a victory. In the afternoons he walked into town with Ranger and bought only what the day demanded: a handful of nails, a small tin of putty, a loaf of bread marked down at Bell's grocery, a can of beans, a used hinge from a coffee can behind the hardware counter. Some people watched him with the cautious interest small towns reserve for weather and strangers. A man near the feed store asked if the Hollow House had started talking yet. Ethan looked at him and said, "Not louder than most folks." The man laughed, surprised into kindness, and let him pass. Nora Bell became the first person to stop pretending not to care. On the fourth day, she drove out in a faded blue pickup and left a box on the porch without knocking. Inside were 2 mason jars of soup, a bundle of rags, 3 candles, and a note that read, "Every house needs light before it needs opinions." Ethan read it twice. He did not know what to do with tenderness when it arrived plainly, without asking to be repaid. Ranger sniffed the box, approved the soup, and sat beside Ethan while he ate on the porch with the sun setting over Alder Run. That evening, Ethan repaired the front door. He planed the swollen edge slowly, listening to the wood the way his father had taught him, shaving off only what was needed. When the door finally closed square in its frame, the sound was so small another man might have missed it. Ethan did not. He stood with his palm against the wood and felt a quiet pressure behind his eyes. For months, maybe years, life had taught him to expect temporary things. Temporary rooms, temporary work, temporary names in other people's mouths. But a door that closed properly made a different promise. It said inside and outside were not the same. It said a man could cross a threshold and belong on one side of it. Each night, Ranger returned to the cracked hearthstone. He would sniff it, circle once, then lie down facing it, ears alert even in sleep. Ethan noticed, of course. He noticed everything about that dog. But the hearth repair was not yet today's work, and Ethan had learned not to rush what kept waiting. First came the leaks, then the door, then the window, then, maybe, the heart of the house. By the end of the first week, the cabin still looked abandoned to anyone passing by too quickly. But inside there was a swept floor, a patched roof, a door that shut, 1 clean window, Ranger's bowl beside the hearth, and Ethan's duffel tucked beneath the loft ladder. It was not much. It was enough. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan slept through the night. Not because the past had grown quiet, but because his hands were tired from building something the future might actually use. The rain came on the 9th evening, not hard, not dramatic. Just a slow autumn rain that whispered through the trees and tapped gently on the patched tin roof as if testing Ethan's work. He sat on an overturned crate near the fireplace, with a cup of black coffee warming both hands, watching the clean line of water slide down the window instead of through it. That alone felt like progress. The cabin still had gaps in places. The loft ladder needed bracing, the back step leaned, and the kitchen shelf dipped in the middle like a tired shoulder. But the room no longer felt abandoned. It had begun to answer him. A door that closed, a roof that held, a floor swept clear. Ranger lay near the hearth, his front paws stretched toward the cracked center stone, his ears moving at sounds Ethan could not hear. For several minutes, the dog was still. Then he lifted his head. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Ranger did not startle. He did not bark. He simply rose, slow and certain, and placed 1 paw on the long pale crack running through the hearthstone. "Don't tell me that's next on your list," Ethan said. Ranger pressed his nose to the stone, breathed in, then scratched once at the edge. Not wild, not careless. A single deliberate scrape. Ethan set down the coffee. "Easy, that old stone's been there longer than both of us." Ranger looked back at him, eyes steady, then scratched again. Rain ticked against the roof. Somewhere in the wall, the old cabin gave a soft wooden pop as the air cooled. Ethan stood, because there were times a man obeyed instinct, and there were times he obeyed the creature who had kept him alive in quieter ways than anyone would ever understand. He crossed the room, knelt beside Ranger, and ran his fingers along the crack. The hearthstone was wide, dark gray, worn smooth in the center by decades of feet and firewood. At first it felt ordinary, cool, solid. Then Ethan tapped it with the handle of his hammer. The sound came back dull near the front edge. He tapped again, closer to the middle. This time it rang differently, hollow. Ranger's ears lifted. Ethan felt the sound move through his hand and into his chest. "Well," he whispered, "I'll be." He did not rush. Rushing broke things that patience could save. He fetched the small pry bar from his toolbox, a folded rag, and the flat wood wedge he had cut from scrap pine that morning. He worked the rag into the crack first, then eased the pry bar under the stone's lip, testing, listening, letting the old mortar tell him how much it would forgive. The first lift was barely anything, a breath, a shift. Dust loosened along the seam. Ranger backed up 2 steps and sat, not afraid, but solemn, as though he understood this was not digging. It was opening. Ethan changed angles, set the wedge, lifted again. The hearthstone rose with a soft scrape that sounded almost like a sigh. Underneath was darkness, a narrow hollow between the stone and the packed foundation. The smell came first: dry earth, cold ash, old cloth. Ethan reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed the beam into the space. Something rested there. Not roots. Not an animal nest, a package. Oilcloth, dark with age, tied with a leather cord so dry it had cracked into tiny lines. For a long moment, Ethan only stared. The rain seemed farther away now. Even Ranger did not move. Ethan slid his hand into the hollow and drew the package out carefully, as if lifting something that still belonged to the hands that had hidden it. It was heavier than he expected. He set it on the hearth, wiped dust from the top, and loosened the cord. Inside was an old bank envelope, folded around a stack of bills, a small brass badge shaped like a mason's trowel, a yellowed paper sealed in a plastic sleeve, and a letter, the handwriting faded but graceful, the kind made by someone who had once taken time even with ordinary words. Ethan touched the envelope first. The bills inside were old but real, counted in 20s and 50s, totaling $1,800. To some people, that was a weekend trip, a new phone, a payment on something shiny. To Ethan, sitting in a cabin bought with his last $40, it felt like a door opening in a wall he had mistaken for the end of the world. But the money was not what made his throat tighten. It was the name at the top of the letter: to whoever has lifted the hearthstone with patient hands. Ranger leaned closer, his nose almost touching the brass badge. Ethan unfolded the first page. The firebox above him was cold and empty, but the room seemed warmer somehow, as though the house had been waiting years for someone to ask the right question. Ethan looked at Ranger, and the dog looked back with calm, ancient certainty. "You found it," Ethan said, voice low. Ranger's tail moved once against the floor. Outside, Alder Run kept moving through the dark, carrying rainwater over stone, while inside the hollow house, a forgotten promise finally came into the light. Ethan sat on the floor with his back against the cold stone of the fireplace, the oilcloth package open beside his knee, and Ranger lying close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The rain had softened to a whisper. It moved over the roof in patient strokes, ran from the eaves, and gathered somewhere beyond the porch in the dark. Inside, the flashlight stood upright in an old coffee mug, throwing a pale circle of light across the letter in Ethan's hands. For a while, he did not read past the first line: to whoever has lifted the hearthstone with patient hands. There was something about those words that made him feel seen in a way he was not prepared for. Not praised, not rescued. Seen. As if a woman long gone had known that the person who found this hidden place would not be someone tearing the house apart for profit, but someone careful enough to listen before breaking what still held. He unfolded the next page slowly. The paper was thin and dry, but the handwriting remained steady. Blue ink faded to the color of old morning sky. "My name is Miriam Whitaker," the letter began, "and if this has come into your hands, then the cabin has outlived me, Harold, and most likely the stories people told because sorrow frightened them." Ethan paused there. Ranger lifted his head, then settled again, his eyes on Ethan's face. The letter continued. "Harold built this hearth first. He said every home needed a heart before it needed a roof, because a roof only keeps weather out, but a hearth reminds people why they come in. He laid these stones himself after work, one by one, with hands so tired they shook by supper. He was a mason by trade, though he never cared for the word trade. He said good work was not just how a man earned his bread, it was how he left respect behind." Ethan looked at the brass badge shaped like a trowel. Its edges were worn smooth, as if someone had carried it in a pocket for years. He ran his thumb over it and imagined Harold Whitaker kneeling where he sat now, fitting stone to stone, believing the future might be warmed by the labor of his hands. The next lines came harder. "Harold and I saved the money you found here for a place we hope to open beside the cabin. Not a business exactly, a repair room, a bench, tools, coffee if we could afford it, and a door open to anyone who needed something mended and did not want to be made small for asking. A widow with a broken chair, a veteran with a busted radio, a farmer with a cracked handle, a man too proud to say he was lonely but willing to bring in a loose hinge. Harold believed people should not have to purchase dignity. They should meet it at the door." Ethan swallowed and lowered the page. The room had gone very still around him. Not empty, listening. He thought of the grocery clerk who had looked at his worn jacket before looking at his face, of Martin's note, of every polite conversation that had found a way to remind him he was temporary. People should not have to purchase dignity. The sentence entered him quietly and stayed. He read on. We never opened the room. Harold died before the walls went up, and after that I let the dream sit in a coffee tin on the shelf. Then I hid it under the hearth. Not because money matters most, but because people sometimes do not honor what they can carry away too easily. If you found this, you have already done the first honest work. You lifted the heart of the house without destroying it. So I am asking you, stranger, not to turn this cabin into a monument to grief. Grief has lived here long enough. Use what is here to make welcome. Use the money if you need it. Keep the badge if it reminds you that hands can bless a place. And if the town still calls this the Hollow House, let them. A hollow thing can become a vessel when the right person fills it. Ethan's vision blurred, but he did not wipe his eyes. He let the feeling come and pass through him like weather through trees. Ranger nudged the edge of the letter with his nose, gentle as a question. Ethan looked down at him and gave a quiet, breathless laugh. She knew, didn't she? He whispered. Ranger's tail brushed the floor once. Ethan picked up the final paper, the plastic sleeve crackling softly. It was a supplemental deed statement, signed by Miriam Whitaker, and witnessed by a local notary years before, giving the lawful owner of the cabin the right to keep the hidden funds and personal token if they were used toward preserving the property or serving its original purpose. Not charity, not pity, purpose. Ethan placed the documents on the hearthstone and sat for a long time, listening to the rain, the creek, the old woods settling around him. $40 had bought him walls. Ranger had found the hidden room beneath the heart. But Miriam Whitaker had given him something no county office could file, and no stranger could laugh away. She had given him a reason to stay. Ethan did not spend the money all at once. That would have felt disrespectful, like eating seed corn, because hunger had made tomorrow hard to imagine. The next morning he laid Miriam's letter, Harold's brass trowel badge, and the old bank envelope on the kitchen shelf, then stood before them with Ranger at his side as sunlight entered through the repaired window. $1,800. It was more than he had held in a long time, and still not much in a world where a roof could swallow half of it before lunch, but it was enough to choose carefully. He walked into Cedar Hollow with a list folded in his pocket and Ranger beside him. And for the first time, the town did not feel like a row of eyes. It felt like a place waiting to be answered. At Harlan's Hardware, he bought roofing screws, sealant, 2 panes of glass, hinges, sandpaper, a used handsaw with good teeth, and a second-hand plane that Ben Harlan pulled from under the counter after watching Ethan count bills with the seriousness of a man paying respects. Ben was 70, narrow as a shovel handle, with hearing aids and hands permanently shaped by work. That plane belonged to my brother, he said. He'd rather it cut wood than sit in a box. Ethan nodded. I'll use it right. Ben looked at Ranger, who sat calmly near the door, then back at Ethan. Folks say you bought the Hollow House. I bought the Whitaker cabin, Ethan said. The correction came out quiet, but it stood in the room. Ben's mouth shifted, almost a smile. Fair enough. Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin began changing in ways even passing strangers could see. The porch lifted straight again. The broken window caught evening light instead of shadows. The roof stopped showing daylight through its seams. Ethan cleaned the stones around the fireplace and reset the hearthstone, leaving the crack visible but sealed. Because some marks were not shameful once they no longer let the cold through. Ranger took ownership of the porch. He greeted visitors with a steady gaze and a single slow wag, never begging for attention, never wasting affection, but making it clear that anyone who came honestly could step closer. Nora Bell came first, carrying coffee and a coffee can full of mismatched screws. Then Ben came with a level, stayed 3 hours and pretended he had only stopped by to check the weather. Grace Miller, who lived near the old church road and repaired quilts for half the county, arrived with cornbread wrapped in a towel and a chair missing 1 rung. Can you fix it? She asked. Ethan looked at the chair, then at her face, and understood the real question was not about furniture. I can try, he said. He fixed it that afternoon, sanding the new rung smooth until it did not look new so much as welcomed. Grace paid him with the cornbread and a jar of peach preserves. He tried to refuse the preserves. She frowned until he accepted them. By the end of the month, Ethan painted a small wooden sign and hung it beside the porch steps. Whitaker Repair Room, Pay what you can. Respect requile. He had considered leaving off the last two words, worried they sounded too sharp. But Miriam's letter would not let him. Respect was not decoration. It was the threshold. People came slowly after that. A retired postal worker brought a cracked walking cane. A diner waitress brought a drawer that would not slide. A farmer brought a toolbox latch. A church volunteer brought a stack of picture frames, damaged by damp storage. Some paid with folded bills. Some paid with eggs, coffee, scrap lumber, tomatoes, or nothing at all except the awkward dignity of being helped without being measured. Ethan never asked for a story before offering a chair. He never made a man explain why a radio mattered or a woman justify why an old frame was worth saving. He simply listened to the object, listened to the person, and did what his hands could do. Slowly, people stopped saying "Hollow House" with that old little lift in their voices. They began saying, "Take it out to Walker's place," or "Ask Ethan," or "Ranger will let you know if he's open." One evening, after the sun dropped behind the pines and the repair room smelled of sawdust, coffee, and warm stone, Ethan stood in the doorway watching Nora, Ben, and Grace sit around the rough table he had built from salvaged boards. They were not doing anything remarkable, just talking, just resting, just being unafraid in a place everyone had once avoided. Ranger lay at Ethan's feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but aware of everything. Ethan looked at the hearth, at Harold's badge on the mantel, at Miriam's letter tucked safely in a frame, and felt the old ache inside him shift shape. It did not disappear, it became useful. By late November, when the last bright leaves had fallen from the maples and Alder Run moved clear and cold over its stones, the Whitaker cabin no longer looked like a place the world had misplaced. It still leaned in small ways. The porch boards did not match. The repaired window on the east wall held a faint ripple in the glass, bending sunrise into soft waves across the floor. The hearthstone still carried its sealed crack through the middle, pale as a scar that had learned to stop hurting. But smoke rose from the chimney most mornings now, not because Ethan needed to prove the house was alive, but because it was. The repair room opened 3 days a week, sometimes 4 if the weather was good, and his hands were not too tired. People came with broken things and stayed for coffee. That was the part Ethan had not expected. A man would bring a loose chair leg and end up talking about the first table he ever built with his father. A woman would bring a cracked frame and sit quietly while Ethan glued the corner, then tell him whose photograph belonged inside it. Not every story was sad. Not every visit became meaningful. Some were simply ordinary, and Ethan had come to understand that ordinary was not small. Ordinary was the sound of Ben Harlan arguing with the old radio. Ordinary was Nora Bell leaving receipts under a coffee mug because she knew Ethan would forget to track expenses. Ordinary was Grace Miller scolding Ranger for looking too noble to beg while slipping him a corner of cornbread anyway. Ordinary was a door opening without shame on either side of it. On the mantel above the fireplace, Ethan kept 3 things: Miriam Whitaker's letter, framed behind plain glass; Harold's brass trowel badge, polished only enough for its shape to catch the firelight; and Ranger's old leather collar from the day Ethan brought him home from the Veteran Support Program, cracked at the buckle, softened by years of weather and trust. Ethan had nearly thrown it away once, back when he was still renting corners of other people's lives, back when keeping old things felt like admitting he had nowhere to put new ones. Now it rested beside Harold's badge as if it had always belonged there. A tool, a token, a promise. On the evening the town held its first small supper at the cabin, nobody called it that officially. There were no flyers, no committee, no speech. Nora brought a pot of beans. Ben brought folding chairs from the hardware store. Grace brought cornbread and preserves. The diner waitress brought coffee in 2 large thermoses. Others came carrying whatever they had: tomatoes put up in jars, napkins, a pie cooling under a towel, a repaired lamp someone wanted Ethan to see lit again. They gathered under the warm porch light and inside the main room, careful at first as if the old roomers might still be offended by laughter. Then Ranger walked through the middle of them, calm as a host, and settled near the hearth with a sigh so satisfied it broke whatever stiffness remained. People laughed. The sound rose into the rafters, touched the stone chimney, and stayed there. Ethan stood near the door, watching the room fill with faces the cabin had once been accused of driving away. No one knew what to call the feeling, so no one tried. That was better. Some things weakened when named too early. Nora came to stand beside him. "You know," she said, "county records still have this listed as Whitaker's Stone Cabin." Ethan nodded. "That's what it is." She looked around the room, her eyes moving over the table, the tools, the people, the dog by the fire. "Folks are starting to call it Walker's Place." Ethan felt the words land gently and deep. For most of his life, places had belonged to other people. His parents' house, then barracks, then rented rooms, borrowed garages, temporary addresses written in pencil because ink felt too confident. Walker's Place. He looked at Ranger, who opened one eye as if he had heard and approved. "Maybe," Ethan said. "But Whitaker stays on the sign." Nora smiled. "I figured you'd say that." Later, when the food was gone and the chairs folded, when everyone had walked back down the road under a moon pale as Riverstone, Ethan remained by the fire with Ranger beside him. He took Miriam's letter from the mantel and read the line again. "A hollow thing can become a vessel when the right person fills it." He thought of the $40 on Nora's counter, of the laughter outside Bell's grocery, of the garage door closing behind him without a sound. He thought of the first night Ranger stood over the cracked hearthstone, listening to what grief had hidden. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's broad head. "You knew before I did," he whispered. Ranger leaned into his palm, warm and steady. Outside, Alder Run kept moving through the dark, carrying leaves, moonlight, and old names toward places Ethan would never see. Inside, the fire settled low, painting the repaired walls in gold. Ethan Walker had come to Cedar Hollow with $40, a tired heart and a German shepherd who refused to give up on him. He spent every dollar on a forgotten stone cabin people said was cursed. In the end, it was not cursed at all. It was waiting for someone who understood that broken things should not be mocked, abandoned, or feared. They should be handled with patience, given honest work, and welcomed back into use. And for Ethan, that made it the best $40 he had ever spent. If this story reminded you that even forgotten places can still hold a purpose, please like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. And tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you most, and where are you watching from tonight?